Today, I'll be trying something a bit different, drawing from an AI-generated photo. This one was created using ChatGPT. One of the main reasons I'm doing this is to avoid copyright issues. Using AI references gives me a bit more freedom, especially for content like this. And I know not everyone will agree with this, but for me, it's actually easier to generate an image that works right away, rather than searching for references on Pinterest. I can control the angles, the lighting, and keep generating variations until I get something that really fits what I'm looking for. But I'm not planning to just copy it exactly as it is. In fact, I want to push it further, improve parts of the image, adjust things that feel off, and make it work better as a drawing. As you can see, the AI photo already looks good, and surprisingly, it looks very realistic. I'm actually really happy with what ChatGPT has done here. But of course, I can still push this further. So instead of treating this like a strict reference, I'm going to treat it more like a starting point. So as you can see, I'm starting with a light sketch, just placing the head, mapping out the eyes, nose and mouth to get everything in the right position. Once that's in, I go straight into rendering the eyes. I'm using my usual charcoal pencil from Marie's for this. At this stage, the eye might already look quite finished, but it's really just the foundation. Once I start building the hair and the skin around it, you'll begin to notice the flaws more clearly. And that's intentional. I'll come back and refine those areas later in the drawing process. When it comes to the mouth, I approach it pretty much the same way as the eyes. This first pass is just a starting point. I'm not trying to fully finish it right away. I don't really like building everything in one go. Instead, I prefer to draw everything in across the whole drawing, then come back and adjust later. For me, that's actually faster and more efficient. It helps everything stay consistent as a whole, rather than overworking one area too early. And there are a few things I keep in mind while doing this: softening the edges, especially on the lower lip, reducing that outlined feeling on the upper lip, and letting some parts almost disappear into the surrounding skin. After sketching out the facial features, I naturally move on to the hair. The goal here is to frame the face with darker values. Hard edges, soft edges, lost edges. That's what really creates the illusion. After sketching out the facial features, I naturally move on to the hair. The goal here is to frame the face with darker values. Once these dark areas are established, I can start lifting and blending some of that charcoal with a blending stump to create mid-tones. And by building those darker values around the face, I'm also setting up the contrast early on. It helps me judge the overall values much more accurately. Because without that range, especially the darks, it's actually very hard to tell if your lighter tones are working correctly. At this point, I completely forgot that I hadn't drawn the eyebrows yet. So I kept staring at the face, wondering why it felt so off. And yeah, that's when it hit me. No eyebrows. So yeah, please never forget to draw eyebrows, especially if you're drawing your girlfriend's portrait for her birthday. Trust me, that's not a risk you want to take. Right, so before I go in and darken the hair, I take advantage of the charcoal that's already on the paper. I'll start dragging and lightly rubbing some of it with my finger to create very soft light values. It's a quick way to build subtle tones without having to apply more material. Before doing this though, make sure your fingers are clean. They naturally have oils on them and you don't want that transferring onto the paper. But if you're concerned about that, you can always use something like cotton or a makeup sponge instead. For me, this is just a regular sketch practice, so I don't mind using my fingers here. Now it's time to be bold and really lay in the dark values for the hair. This is one of the key steps in my workflow. Without establishing these darks early on, it becomes really difficult to judge the overall values of the portrait. But even here, I try to be intentional. I'm not just filling everything in. I'm placing the darkest values only where they truly belong, while keeping the mid-tones and highlights as clean as possible. At the same time, this is where I start pushing the drawing a bit further beyond the reference. In the original photo, the hair is pretty much just one dark mass, and personally, I don't really like that. It feels a bit flat. So instead, I'm going to introduce some highlights into the hair, breaking it up a bit to give it more form and dimension. Again, not just copying, but improving as I go. For the hair highlights and mid-tones, I mainly use a blending stump to redistribute the charcoal that's already on the paper. This actually helps me achieve two things at the same time. It softens the texture and it builds mid-tones much more efficiently. Instead of lightly shading everything with a charcoal pencil, which can take more time and control, I can quickly move the existing charcoal around and get a smoother result. It's a simple step, but it really speeds up the process while keeping the transitions nice and soft. And, as you can see, the hair is already looking pretty solid without me having to fully render it with the pencil. That's really the result of placing the right values in the right areas, combined with a bit of texture from the charcoal pencil earlier. So instead of drawing every single strand, I'm letting the values and textures do most of the work. And since my blending stump is already loaded with charcoal, I'm going to use it to create some loose, slightly abstract textures for her clothing. This is where I start to step away from the reference a bit and do my own thing. And before I continue with the more abstract parts, I want to go back for a bit. Like I mentioned earlier, everything I've put down so far is just the initial pass. Now that the whole drawing is established, it's much easier to see what's actually off. Some of the values aren't quite there yet. The eyes aren't dark enough, the highlights in the shadow areas are missing, and the hair still needs more structure and detail. So before moving forward, I'm going to take some time to address these and push the drawing further. For me, the eyes are the most important part of any portrait, so they always get top priority. I'm going to push the contrast here, darken the eyes and make them feel more alive and focused. But it's not just the eyes themselves. The surrounding areas matter just as much, especially that plane where the eye socket transitions into the bridge of the nose. There's always subtle shading there, and skipping it makes the eyes feel flat. And of course, since girls like wearing eyeliner, that's something I always double check as well, making sure the thickness, sharpness and placement feel right, because it really affects how the eyes read. And also the under eye area too. If there's no hint of an eye bag, she'll look a bit pale and flat, but if it's too dark, suddenly she looks insomniac, like she hasn't slept in 3 days. Who knows, maybe she's a vampire after all. So it's about finding that balance, just enough to make it believable without overdoing it. The skin also has its own highlights, especially on the higher points, like the bridge of the nose and the cheekbones. If you miss these, the drawing can start to look flat pretty quickly. I like to bring these out using my Tombow Mono Zero eraser. It feels really natural, almost like I'm drawing, but with an eraser instead. Of course, if you don't have this eraser, a regular eraser works just fine. If you need a sharper point for more precise highlights, you can always shape or sharpen the eraser a bit. It might feel a little wasteful, but honestly, do whatever it takes to get the result you want. And as always, I'm paying close attention to the edges and the smoothness of the transitions, making sure everything blends naturally without losing the structure. The mouth works in a similar way. If it's too pale, it can look a bit lifeless. That's partly why lipstick exists in the first place. So I like to darken the lips slightly, but not too much, so it still feels natural. Most of the edges around the lips are actually very soft. The only area that tends to have a slightly firmer edge is the line where the lips meet, but even that shouldn't feel overly outlined. And don't forget the shading around the corners of the mouth. If you skip that, the lips can start to look flat and a bit cartoony instead of sitting naturally on the face. And lastly, don't forget the highlight on the lower lip. That small detail can really enhance the portrait, almost like a catch light for the lips, giving them that extra sense of volume and life. At this point, the drawing is almost complete. From here, it's really about slowing down and observing. I'm not adding anything major anymore, just making small adjustments, checking proportions, refining edges, and making sure all the values feel balanced. This is where everything comes together. I'll go back and forth across the drawing, softening anything that feels too harsh, sharpening areas that need more focus, and cleaning up any distractions. Sometimes it's just tiny changes, a slightly darker shadow, a softer transition, a cleaner highlight, but those small tweaks make a big difference in the final result. And honestly, this stage is more about patience than skill. Knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing what to fix, because it's very easy to overwork a drawing at this point. And I think this one gets pretty close already. The last thing I want to do is loosely render the fur jacket. I'm using the blending stump again here, keeping everything soft and suggestive rather than fully detailed. I don't want to render it too realistically because that would start to compete with the face. The focus should always stay on the portrait. So instead, I keep it a bit rough and unfinished on purpose. It adds a sense of intention and honestly makes the drawing feel more interesting overall. I do hope you guys like my new drawing, and don't forget, if you want to watch the real-time process of this drawing and draw along, you can join my YouTube membership or Patreon. Thank you so much for all your support and have a fantastic day.